Welcome to Studio 21. Our guest today is Thomas DeWolf, the author of Inheriting the Trade. You started an unusual journey about 10 years ago or so, a little research into your family history. Who is James DeWolf?
Well, there's a lot of James DeWolf, but the one I'm sure you're referring to was sort of the patriarch of this family, the most successful slave trader in the history of the United States. He was in the second of three generations of this family that was involved in the slave trade. And it was three generations over the course of about 50 years and responsible for bringing roughly 10,000 African people from West Africa into North and South America and the West Indies.
Now, you had to do a heck of a detective job here. You had some relatives helping. How many relatives started looking at this issue?
Well, you know, it started with one, and that's my cousin Katrina Brown, my seventh cousin, very distant relative. She's the one who, when she learned this history from her grandmother, decided to make a film, Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north, and invited a whole bunch of folks who are related to her to join her in this journey. I mean, a lot of the research had been done. When you're related, this guy, James DeWolf, also ended up being a United States Senator and died the second richest man in America, reportedly, in 1837. So when you're rich and a senator, they tend to keep a lot of records about you. So the research, the basic research was not difficult to do, and it had been done before I ever got involved. There were books written and what have you about that history.
When you're growing up, how aware were you of all this?
Zero.
When did you first become aware? Did your cousin say, hey, did you know this?
Actually, a fireman in my hometown walks up the steps one day to the restaurant that I owned and said, I think we might be related. My dad's middle name is DeWolf. And it turned out to be true, and his father's the family historian on his line. And we're so far distant. The first slave trader in the family had an older brother. That's my ancestor. And so you go back a long way to get to a seventh cousin. But this gentleman taught me this family history, and that was back in the early 1980s. So that was the first time I really learned about any of this, was when I was, in my late 20s, early 30s, that I knew any of it.
I think all of us have some history in our family that, somebody was a horse trader.
Everybody's got heroes and horse thieves, no question.
Was this kept a secret, do you think, for some generations?
Oh, certainly. It depends on your family. In some families, there are branches of the family that are more open than others. But anytime you've got really horrible history, there's a tendency to want to bury that sort of sullied part of the family history. And it's not unusual, it's not surprising, but it's also not very healthy in the long run.
So the family fortune from almost the beginning of our history in our country, your family fortune at that time was based on the slave trade. What exactly did James DeWolf do? Did he own ships?
Yep. And I mean, the thing to keep in mind, too, is this is one family story, but this entire nation was built, the economy was built on an enslavement system. And so there's nobody's life that was here that wasn't touched by this system. This particular family, James DeWolf was a very savvy businessman. Yes, he owned a lot of ships. Foundation of his wealth was in the slave trade, but he really got wealthy during the War of 1812 as a privateer. He had more ships than the United States Navy at that time. We didn't have a large Navy, but he had a lot of ships and made just a ton of dough, ransacking British vessels out in the open sea. So,
well, the economy, when we look at the issue of slavery, a lot of times we look to the South as well. It was a Southern issue.
Right.
You're saying this is a national issue?
It was the biggest surprise to me, because I had a standard public school education where I grew up in California, and I knew nothing. When like most people, what I was taught, you think slavery, you think Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Virginia, and it's because the North wins this battle between the states, and then they write the history books and paint themselves as noble abolitionists marching south to straighten out those crazy people down in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia. When the reality is there was slavery in the North for over 200 years. More than 95% of all slave trading was done out of northern ports, northern ships, northern financing, northern insurance companies, northern crews. So it was a history that they tried to do a really good job of burying. And I think over the last 20, 30 years is when scholars, researchers, historians have really begun being more clear about the real history. And I mean, Howard Zinn was one of the real, I think, early strong people who came out with the People's History of the United States, and there's been many others since then. Eric Foner, a lot of folks that have written wonderful scholarship about history that was certainly not taught in any classroom I was in as a child.
Well, you became a student in order to understand more about your family history.
Yeah.
Where did you start your journey?
Boy, that's a good question. The actual journey that began the filmmaking process and my book writing process was in Bristol, Rhode Island, where the family operated out of. And we spent a little over a week there learning all these bits of history about the family, the town, the state of Rhode Island, which was responsible for virtually half of all slave trading in the United States. Things that I just never knew. And we met with historians, we went to sites, family sites, city sites, and state sites, historic sites in Rhode Island before heading off for Ghana in West Africa, because we had records from 200 years earlier about the family doing business, trading primarily rum, but other commodities for African people on the coast of West Africa.
What do you know about the slave trade in Ghana then?
A lot more than I ever knew before. You know, in this country, we really focus on this country's issues to the degree that we do. We don't really look at what took place in Africa. And, you know, though it was primarily the Europeans and to a much smaller degree people from this country doing business there, African people themselves were enslaving each other and selling, you know, their fellow people to the Europeans and the Americans at the coast. But, you know, my ancestors weren't going inland to capture people. They were trading for commodities, valuable.
And they went to that port,
They went
that
to
entry gate.
Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, the dungeons where people were held in completely inhumane conditions in very tight, horrible quarters.
You went into the dungeons.
Yeah, yeah.
There was one incident that I read about that really got your attention.
It was the most horrific moment of the entire journey for me, and I think for many of my cousins. We were being given a tour of Cape Coast Castle, the top floor where the governor and, you know, the person in charge of the facility lived and did all his business, and then the main courtyard, which is where the church was located, and open area and all the cannon in place to fight off marauders, and then the dungeons are down below. And so that was where we were ending up our tour, and we're down there and the cameras are set up for filming in the documentary, and the battery died, so the lights went out. And so we sat in the pitch black darkness. There's no electricity in the rooms down there. And I would say 15 or 20 minutes, which felt like an hour or more, just with our own thoughts in silence. We didn't talk. And just, you know, for me it was imagining what it would have been like to be in this space 200 years ago, and just the complete despair of being taken from your home, your family, your children, your parents, whatever the case may be, your loved ones, and being in this place. And, you know, many of the people around you don't speak the same language. It was the most complete feeling of utter despair I've ever had in my life. Also recognizing, you know, I was a white man in the year 2001, and I was going to get out of there
In 20 minutes or whatever. Yeah.
And I can't grasp the full depth of the horror of that place. But what I did experience was just beyond horror.
Just a sense of that, because
Yeah.
I imagine in the reality of several hundred years ago or more, the crowd, the smell.
Oh, you just, I
everything.
mean, in a space that it's 450 square feet. I paced it off, and they would have held as many as up to 200 men in a space, 450 square feet, for up to 12 weeks, waiting for a ship to come and take them across the Middle Passage. And what we have is the horrible conditions that we see, the images of the ships and how people are packed so tightly together, and the Roots miniseries and all the documentaries that have come since, the Amistad and what have you. And we don't think about the horror that took place before, you know, in addition to that. And even if there's only 50 people, I mean, imagine living in a home that's 450 square feet. But to have dozens or 100 or 200 men with you for extended periods of time.
Do we have
Terrible.
any idea how many people must have died in that holding area or on ships?
You know, that's that's a big unknown, and something that all they have is estimates, and the estimates vary widely. W.E.B. Du Bois did the first extensive survey of that kind of information, and he estimated there may have been as many as 5 people dying for every person who made it from capture to the dungeons to the Middle Passage to surviving in this country or Brazil or Cuba or what have you. That there may have been as many as 5 people that died. Others think it wasn't nearly that many who died, but there were definitely a lot of people that died along the way. People that died in wars when African people would be captured. It was oftentimes as a result of intertribal warfare, and the victors capture whoever's still alive and sells them. And then the trip could be 100 miles or 1,000 miles from inland to the coast. People died along that way. People dying at the dungeons themselves. I mean, it's suffocatingly hot. I mean, it's 5 degrees from the equator, and so it's always hot. And you're in this enclosed space with all these other people, and putrid. You're in your own bodily waste of all these people, and people with illness that spreads very easily. And then the Middle Passage, they do have much better records from that point. From the Middle Passage on, they figure roughly 15% of people died. Crew members as well as the Africans who were enslaved, roughly the same percentages of people died on slave trading voyages.
Well, the Cape Coast Castle has been preserved. I imagine
Yes.
the government of Ghana operates it. And
They do now, yes.
and they probably have tour guides.
Yes.
Did you learn anything from them that you
Sure.
didn't know?
Well, just, a lot of the history, we just didn't know the history of Ghana, the history of, the West African region. And so we learned a lot from their perspective and the recognition of their complicity as well. I mean, the country of Benin, which is right near Ghana, issued an official apology to the descendants of people who were enslaved on behalf of the government of Benin for historic system of slavery. So this is something that happens. It's I guess a human condition, that this taking advantage and oppressing other people for one's own enrichment. It's not distinct to people of European descent, but in this particular system, European people were certainly the vast majority of those in control of the system and made incredibly wealthy as a result of this system.
And the United States making money. I want to read.
Well, and I include people,
Yeah.
you and me,
Yeah.
as descendants of Europeans as well. Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to read a quote because I was doing a little research on this.
Uh-huh.
Chief Justice John Marshall in 1825, he was making a court ruling on this whole issue of slavery, and he said African slave trade is contrary to the laws of nature, but consistent with the laws of nations. And he said, okay, then we can continue with this, which just was an amazing statement when you realize that this is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, somebody who is, in our history, is so well respected.
Well, and 4 out of the first 5 presidents were owners of enslaved people. Only John Adams of the first 5 presidents was not a slaveholder himself. And, the church from the very top of the leadership of the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, were supportive, and the Bible was used as justification for the enslavement of African people and enslavement of other people as well. I mean, slavery goes clear back to Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. It's always been a part of our condition and remains so today. I mean, there's more people enslaved today than at any other point in human history. But you look at the church's complicity, every one of these castles, Cape Coast Castle, the church is right above the men's dungeon. Elmina Castle, church, right above the dungeons, in the main, the main floor. And that was a very common part of the construction of these slave forts, was to have a church involved. So it's government and laws, it's it's your spiritual, I mean, it's every aspect of society, and certainly the entire economic system.